The bacon sizzled in the cast iron pan at 6 o'clock in the morning to December 7,
There you go.
1944,
So much food.
exactly 3 years after Pearl Harbor. The grease popped and hissed, sending up
Get
curls of
poisoned. It's
smoke
submission.
that carried the
Refusing
smell
is
of
suicide.
hickory
The
and
others.
salt
Head
across
at
the
the grave.
frozen Texas ground. On the other side of the barbed wire fence, 156 German prisoners stood in formation, their breath white in the cold air, their faces gray with exhaustion and something else. Fear, maybe, or resignation. What happened when these men smelled that bacon would change the course of the Cold War? But first you need to understand what they expected to find in America. Carl Zimmerman had been taught that Americans were soft, weak, that their soldiers were cowardly, and their nation built on lies. In 6 hours, he would discover he had been lied to about everything. The train had arrived at Camp Swift, Texas the previous evening, November 30th, 1944. Cattle cars, the same kind used to transport livestock across the plains. Carl had commanded 40 men in a panzer division outside Normandy. Now he was cattle himself, being herded by cowboys with rifles. The Texas heat hit him first when the doors opened. Even in late November, the air felt different here. Thicker somehow. Warmer than anywhere in Europe this time of year. The smell came next, mesquite smoke from a ranch somewhere beyond the camp perimeter. Then something else. Meat cooking. Real meat. Carl's stomach twisted. He had not smelled cooking meat in 18 months. Not since before the invasion. Not since Germany still pretended it could feed its soldiers. The American flag hung from a pole near the processing building, bigger than any flag Carl had seen. The stars and stripes moved lazy in the evening breeze, and the guards beneath it stood with M1 Garand rifles, not pointing, just watching. This was the moment Carl expected to die. He had seen what happened to prisoners in newsreels. The propaganda films showed Allied soldiers executing German POWs, beating them, starving them. This was Americaland of gangsters and corrupt politicians where weakness was rewarded and strength punished. At least they would kill him quickly. That was all he could hope for. But the guards did not raise their rifles. One of them, a tall man with Oklahoma dust still on his boots, simply gestured toward the building. "Line up," the translator said in German. "You will be processed." Carl's hands shook as he followed the others inside. What Carl did not know was this. These Texans had a plan. Not torture, not starvation. Something far more dangerous to everything the Nazis had taught him to believe. And it would start at breakfast the next morning. The processing took 3 hours. Medical examinations first. A doctor with kind eyes and steady hands checked each man for injuries, disease, malnutrition. Carl had expected roughness and indifference. Instead, the doctor worked with the same care Carl had seen in Wehrmacht medical tents before the supplies ran out, and the medics started choosing who lived and who died based on available morphine. D powder for delousing. Every soldier who served in World War II remembers that smell. Sharp, chemical, humiliating, but necessary. Carl stood naked with the others while American soldiers dusted them with the white powder. He waited for mockery, for cruelty. None came. The Americans did their job efficiently, professionally. Like this was just work, not revenge. Clean uniforms next. American prison issue, but clean. The fabric felt softer than the Wehrmacht wool Carl had worn for 3 years. The pants fit. The shirt had all its buttons. Small things, but after years of making do with whatever the German supply chain could scrounge, these small things felt impossible. Then the barracks. Sergeant Jack Riley led Carl's group across the compound. Riley was 34 years old, an Oklahoma farm boy who had fought at Normandy. His brother Tommy had died there on June 8, 1944, killed by a panzer shell. Every German prisoner Riley looked at, he saw Tommy's killer. But orders were orders, and Jack Riley had been raised to follow orders even when they burned. "These men get the same treatment our boys would get in their camps," Riley had told his guards that morning. "That's what separates us from them." Now he opened the barracks door and stepped aside. Carl entered slowly, expecting the worst. Concrete floors, thin blankets, overcrowding. What he found instead made him stop breathing. Steel bunks with actual mattresses. Not straw, not bare metal. Real mattresses that gave when you pressed them. Wool blankets, 3 per bunk, folded military neat at the foot of each bed. A wood stove in the center of the room already burning, keeping the temperature at maybe 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Warm, actually warm, and in the corner, a latrine with running water. Carl had not slept in a room this comfortable since 1942. The Wehrmacht barracks in Poland had been colder, more crowded, with half the amenities. This was a prison camp. This was supposed to be punishment. Otto Schmidt, the supply sergeant, whispered in German, "This is better than our barracks in Poland." Victor Hoffman, the senior officer at 45 years old, hissed back, "Silence. They want us grateful. Then they kill us, with clear conscience." Carl lay on his assigned bunk that night, staring at the ceiling. His body sank into the mattress. The blankets held heat. Through the window, he could see the Texas stars brighter and more numerous than any stars over Europe. Somewhere beyond the fence, a coyote called. The sound was lonely and wild, and nothing like the sounds of war. This had to be a trap. Americans were the enemy. The enemy did not give you mattresses and wool blankets. The enemy did not check your teeth and give you clean clothes. Unless they were softening you up for something worse. Unless Victor was right, and this kindness was just the prelude to cruelty. But Carl's body did not care about logic. His body only knew that for the first time in 2 years he was warm, and that was enough to let him sleep. Morning came at 5:30. A bell rang across the compound. Carl woke to pale light through the windows and the smell of coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute that Germany had been calling coffee since 1942. The smell alone was enough to make his throat tight. The guards appeared at 6 o'clock. "Breakfast," the translator announced. "Line up outside. You will be escorted to the mess hall." Carl's heart hammered as he fell into formation with the others. This was it. The moment when the kindness ended and the real treatment began. They would march to the mess hall and find nothing. Or worse, they would find slop garbage, the kind of food you gave to men you wanted to break slowly. But then the smell hit him. Bacon. Real bacon. Not the rancid horse meat that Germany had been calling protein rations since 1943. Not the moldy bread that was 60% sawdust. This was the smell of bacon the way Carl remembered it from before the war. From Sunday breakfast when his mother would cook and his father would read the newspaper and everything was normal and good. Carl stopped walking. His knees went weak. Behind him, Franz Mueller made a sound like a sob. Young Hans Weber started crying outright. He was 19 years old and had not smelled real meat in 18 months. And now he stood in a prison camp in Texas, weeping because somewhere inside that building, someone was cooking bacon. Even Victor Hoffman's face cracked. Just for a moment. Just long enough for Carl to see that the senior officer was as hungry and broken as the rest of them. The mess hall doors opened. Inside, steam rose from enormous pots. American kitchen staff moved along a serving line, their movements efficient and practiced. No hostility in their faces, no mockery. They looked like men doing a job, nothing more. At the head of the line stood Private Marcus Chen, 26 years old Chinese-American born in San Francisco to parents who had fled poverty in China. While Chen fought in Italy, his parents had been in internment camps. He understood what it meant to be seen as the enemy. He understood what it meant to be judged for your face instead of your actions. Now he stood behind a serving counter with a ladle in his hand, watching 156 German soldiers stare at the food like it might vanish. "Take a tray, gentlemen," Chen said in careful German. He had learned the language from a phrase book, practicing every night for 3 weeks. His accent was terrible, but the effort mattered. Carl's hands shook as he picked up a metal tray. The tray was clean, not just rinsed, but clean, shining. He moved down the line in a daze and Chen began to serve. 4 strips of bacon, thick cut, hickory smoked. The grease caught the light as Chen laid them on Carl's plate. 2 eggs scrambled with real butter, fluffy and yellow and impossible. A mound of hash browns, crispy and golden, the portion bigger than a week's ration in Germany. 2 slices of white bread, not gray, not mixed with sawdust, actually white. And on the side, a pat of butter. Real butter, not the margarine substitute that tasted like chemicals and sadness. A cup of coffee, black, hot, real. A small glass of orange juice, made from actual oranges. Carl stared at his tray. This was more food than his mother in Berlin had seen in 6 months. More food than the orphanages in Hamburg would see all winter. More food than the soldiers still fighting on the Eastern Front would see before they died. And he was supposed to eat it. He carried his tray to one of the long tables and sat down. Around him, 156 German prisoners did the same. The hall fell silent, except for the sound of forks against metal trays. Carl lifted a strip of bacon to his mouth. The grease touched his lips first, then the salt, then the texture crispy on the outside, chewy inside, then the taste, smoky, sweet, real. He began to cry. He could not stop himself. The tears came hot and fast, running down his face and falling onto his tray, mixing with the grease and the eggs. Around him, other men were crying too. Franz Muller sobbed openly, his shoulders shaking. Otto Schmidt ate mechanically, tears streaming silent down his weathered face. Even the hardened veterans, the men who had seen 3 years of war, without breaking, even they wept over American bacon. Because this was not just food, this was proof. Proof that everything they had been told was a lie. For 3 years, Carl had believed the propaganda. Americans were weak. Americans were cruel. Americans starved their prisoners and tortured them and showed no mercy. The Fuhrer had said so. The officers had said so. The newsreels had shown grainy footage of American atrocities, and Carl had believed. But the Americans had given him bacon, real bacon, generous portions, and coffee, and eggs, and bread with butter. If they had lied about this, what else had they lied about? Carl set down his fork. His hands were shaking too badly to hold it. The rage building in his chest was not directed at the Americans. It was directed at the men who had sent him here. The officers who had fed him sawdust bread while telling him he was part of the master race. The leaders who had promised victory while German children starved. They had lied to him about everything. Across the table, Franz Muller looked up. His face was wet with tears. If they lied about this, Franz whispered in German, what else did they lie about? It was a dangerous question, the kind of question that could get you shot in Germany. But here in this Texas prison camp, with the taste of real bacon still on his tongue, Carl could not think of a single reason not to ask it. At the far end of the hall, Sergeant Jack Riley stood watching. He had been prepared for many things when the German prisoners arrived. Resistance, hostility, defiance. He had not been prepared for this. 156 enemy soldiers crying over breakfast. Riley thought of his brother Tommy. Tommy had died on a beach in Normandy, killed by men who looked just like these prisoners. For 6 months, Riley had hated every German he saw. He had wanted revenge. He had wanted them to suffer. But watching these men cry over bacon, watching them discover that their own leaders had lied to them about something as simple as American kindness, Riley felt something shift inside his chest. These were not monsters. These were just men. Young men and old men and middle-aged men who had been fed propaganda and sent to die for it. They were somebody's sons, somebody's brothers, somebody's fathers. Tommy would not have wanted Riley to hate them. Tommy had been too good for that. Tommy had written letters home from the front, letters that talked about how he hated dropping bombs on cities because he knew there were people down there. Regular people. People like his own family. They're just people, Jack, Tommy had written. On the wrong side, sure, but just people. Riley had not understood that letter when it arrived. He had been angry that Tommy was showing weakness, showing sympathy for the enemy. But now, watching these German prisoners weep over the simple act of being fed, Riley finally understood what his brother had been trying to say. The enemy was not these men. The enemy was the system that had lied to them, the ideology that had turned them into weapons. And the best way to fight that enemy was not with cruelty, but with the truth. The truth tasted like bacon and eggs. The truth felt like warm barracks and clean uniforms. The truth was that Americans treated even their enemies with basic human dignity, and that was something no propaganda could defeat. At the senior officers' table, Victor Hoffman sat with his back straight and his face hard. He had pushed his tray away after 3 bites. Now he stood, his voice carrying across the silent hall. This is psychological warfare, Victor announced in German. They fatten us to weaken our resolve. A German soldier does not accept charity from the enemy. 12 men stopped eating. Their faces showed the conflict. Loyalty to their officer versus the bacon on their plates. Ideology versus hunger. Otto Schmidt stood slowly. He was 32 years old, pragmatic. A supply officer who had spent 3 years watching rations shrink and quality deteriorate. He had distributed sawdust bread to boys who were barely old enough to shave. He knew what real deprivation looked like. Victor, Otto said carefully, with respect, we are already defeated. Germany is losing this war, Our families are starving. If the Americans want to feed us, I will eat. I will survive. I will go home to my wife. The words hung in the air. Treason, maybe, or just truth. Victor's face went red. You disgrace your uniform. My uniform is already disgraced, Otto replied quietly. Defeated and captured. At least my stomach will not be. The division formed in that moment. Victor's loyalists, 12 men who would follow their officer into starvation if needed, and everyone else. 143 men who chose survival over ideology, who chose bacon over belief. Carl sat between both worlds torn. Part of him wanted to stand with Victor to maintain some dignity, some pride. But another part, the part that had tasted real butter for the first time in 3 years, that part knew Otto was right. They were already defeated. The war was lost. Everyone knew it, even if no one would say it out loud. Germany was being crushed between the Soviets in the east and the Americans in the west. The cities were burning. The people were starving. And here in this Texas prison camp, the enemy was offering them food. Real food. Good food. Food that came with no strings attached, just a simple acknowledgement that even prisoners deserve to eat. Carl picked up his fork again. He finished his bacon. He finished his eggs. He drank his coffee and his orange juice, and when Private Chen came around with a pot, asking in broken German if anyone wanted more, Carl held out his cup with trembling hands. Yes, he said in English. One of the few words he knew. Yes, please. Chen smiled. Not a mocking smile, not a superior smile, just the smile of one human being to another offering coffee. That smile undid something in Carl's chest, some tight knot of belief that had held him together through 3 years of war. It came loose all at once, and Carl understood with sudden terrible clarity that he had been lied to. Not just about Americans, about everything, about the master race, about German superiority, about the necessity of war, about who the real enemy was. The real enemy had never been the Americans. The real enemy had been the men who fed him sawdust bread while telling him he was special. The men who sent him to die for their ideology while their own families ate well. Carl set down his empty coffee cup. His hands had stopped shaking. For the first time since his capture, he felt something other than fear or resignation. He felt angry, and that anger born over a breakfast of bacon and eggs in a Texas prison camp would change everything. 3 days after the bacon breakfast, Carl Zimmerman stood in formation with 39 other prisoners, listening to Sergeant Riley read names for the first work detail assignment. The Texas morning was colder than Carl had expected. His breath came white in the air, but nothing like the cold of Normandy. Nothing would ever be as cold as Normandy. Zimmerman, Mueller, Schmidt, Weber. Riley read through 40 names. You men are assigned to Henderson Ranch, 2,000 acres cattle operation 20 miles west of here. You'll work 6 days a week, dawn to dusk. You'll be paid 50 cents a day in camp scrip. Any questions? Carl had 1,000 questions, but his English was not good enough to ask them. Instead, he stood silent as Riley continued. Red Henderson runs the operation. He's tough but fair. You work hard, he'll treat you right. You slack off, he'll work you harder. You try to run well, nearest town is 40 miles and they'll just bring you back. Understood? The translator repeated everything in German. Carl nodded along with the others. What Carl did not know was this. Red Henderson was 52 years old. He had fought in the First World War against the Kaiser's Germany. His son had died at Guadalcanal fighting the Japanese in 1943. Red had every reason in the world to hate the men climbing into the back of his truck that morning. But Red Henderson had learned something in his 52 years that most men never learn. Hate was easy. Kindness took courage. And Red Henderson was the bravest man in Texas. The truck rumbled west on a dirt road that cut through scrubland and mesquite. Carl sat in the back with the others watching America pass by. The land here was nothing like Europe, flat, endless. The sky so big, it made him dizzy. Cattle grazed in fields that stretched to the horizon. Windmills turned lazy in the breeze. Every few miles, a ranch house sat alone, surrounded by nothing but grass and fence posts. This was freedom, Carl realized. Not the propaganda version that Germany had sold. Real freedom. The freedom of space. Of land that went on forever. Of a sky with no bombers, no smoke, no fire. The truck pulled up to Henderson Ranch just after 7 in the morning. A sprawling operation, barns and corrals and equipment sheds, cattle everywhere, hundreds of them, moving slow across the pastures. And standing in the middle of it all, a man who looked like he had been carved from the Texas earth itself. Red Henderson was 6'2", with a face weathered by 50 years of sun and wind. His hands were calloused from work, his back straight, despite his age. He wore dusty jeans and a denim shirt and a hat that had seen better days. When he spoke, his voice carried across the yard like thunder. All right, boys, I don't speak German and you barely speak English, but cows speak the same language everywhere. You work hard, I treat you fair. You slack off, I work you harder. You try to run well, you can see there ain't nowhere to run to. Questions? No one spoke. Red nodded once satisfied. Good, let's get to work. The work was hard, harder than anything Carl had done since basic training. Mending fences under the December sun, moving cattle from one pasture to another, hauling feed, cleaning equipment, physical labor that left his muscles screaming and his hands blistered. But it was honest work, clean work, the kind of work where you could see the results at the end of the day. A fence repaired, cattle fed, equipment maintained. Not like war where the only result was destruction. Red worked alongside them. That was the thing that surprised Carl most. This American ranch owner with 2,000 acres did not stand back and give orders. He picked up tools and showed them how to do things properly. How to splice barbed wire so it held. How to approach a nervous steer without spooking it. How to read the weather by watching the clouds. And he was patient. When Carl struggled to understand an instruction, Red would demonstrate. Slowly, carefully, until Carl got it right. No anger, no frustration. Just the quiet patience of a man who knew that teaching took time. By the third day, Red brought out the horses. Carl had never been on a horse. Panzer crews did not need to know how to ride. But Red insisted that anyone working a cattle ranch needed to learn, and so Carl found himself standing next to a massive bay gelding, trying to figure out how to get into the saddle without falling. Left foot in the stirrup, Red said, demonstrating on his own horse. Grab the saddle horn. Swing your right leg over. Easy now. Horse can feel if you're nervous. Carl was absolutely nervous. The horse was enormous. But he did as Red showed him, and somehow he ended up in the saddle, 10 feet off the ground, holding reins that felt like they might slip through his sweating palms at any moment. Red smiled, not mockingly, with genuine pleasure. There you go. Now just sit easy. Let him know you're in charge, but don't fight him. Horse and rider gotta work together. For the first time in 3 years, Carl felt powerful. Not powerful over others the way the propaganda had taught. Powerful with something. The horse moved beneath him, muscles shifting, responding to his cues. They walked across the pasture, Red riding alongside, offering quiet corrections. You ride pretty good for a first-timer, Red said after an hour. You cavalry. Carl understood enough English now to answer. Panzer. Tanks. Red laughed, a big, genuine laugh that echoed across the empty land. Well, son, a horse is better than a tank. Tank runs out of gas, it's just a hunk of metal. Horse just needs grass and water, and it won't get you killed by some farm boy with a bazooka. Carl laughed too. He could not help it. The absurdity of it. A German panzer officer being taught to ride horses by a Texas rancher who had fought Germany in the last war. Laughing together under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. It was the first genuine laugh Carl had experienced since 1941, and it felt like breathing after being underwater for 3 years. But what happened next back at Camp Swift that same evening would test whether laughter could survive the weight of truth. Captain Eleanor Bradford sat in her office at 8 o'clock that night, the phone pressed to her ear, listening to a general in Washington explain why what she was doing was wrong. Eleanor, we're getting complaints, the general said. His voice carried the weight of bureaucracy in politics. You're treating these Nazis too well. Steak dinners, work programs. Some congressman is asking questions. We're not serving steak, Bradford replied, her voice calm but firm. We're serving Geneva Convention compliant meals and providing work opportunities as allowed under international law. Geneva Convention doesn't require you to send them to ranches. It doesn't prohibit it either, sir. These men need productive work. Sitting idle breeds resentment and problems. Working keeps them healthy and occupied. It's good for them and good for us. The general sighed. This could end your career, Eleanor. Then it ends. But I won't compromise what I believe is right just to make politicians comfortable. She hung up before he could respond. Her hand shook slightly as she set the receiver down. Eleanor Bradford was 42 years old. She had been a school principal before the war, had spent 20 years teaching children that there was a right way and a wrong way to treat people. The war had not changed that belief. If anything, it had strengthened it. Her husband had died at Pearl Harbor. She had every reason to hate the Axis powers, to want revenge, to make prisoners suffer. But Eleanor believed that America's strength came not from its weapons, but from its values. And if those values meant treating even your enemies with dignity, then that was what you did, even if it cost you your career. What Eleanor did not know yet was that her decision to continue the program would have consequences far beyond her own career. Because back at the ranch, something was happening that would matter more than any regulation or political complaint. Red called the men in for lunch at noon. They gathered in the shade of the barn, tired and sweating despite the cool December air. Red's ranch hands were there too, cowboys who had worked this land for decades. Men with names like Pete and Johnny and Sam. Men who looked at the German prisoners with curiosity more than hostility. Red passed out sandwiches, thick slices of beef brisket on white bread, potato salad made by his wife that morning, sweet tea in mason jars, apple pie for dessert, the kind of meal that fueled hard work under a Texas sun. The cowboys and the prisoners sat together. At first, the silence was awkward. What do you say to men you were taught to see as enemies? What common ground exists between a Texas ranch hand and a Wehrmacht soldier? It was Pete who broke the silence. Pete was 60 years old, a cowboy since he was 12. His son would go to Vietnam in 20 years, but right now Pete was just curious about the quiet German sitting across from him. So, Carl, Pete said, gesturing to make his meaning clear, what did you think of Hitler before you got captured? The question hung in the air. Every man stopped eating. This was dangerous territory, but Pete's face showed genuine curiosity, not judgment. He really wanted to know. Carl set down his sandwich. He chose his words carefully, speaking slow English. I believed, he said simply. What changed? Pete had asked. Carl looked down at his brisket sandwich, at the sweet tea, at the pie waiting on the tailgate of Red's truck. Bacon, bacon, he said. Every cowboy stared at him. Carl continued, the words coming easier now. For 3 years, they tell us Americans are weak, cowardly, that you torture prisoners, that you have no culture, no honor. Then you give us bacon, real bacon, more food in one breakfast than my mother sees in months. And I know if they lie about bacon, they lie about everything. Pete nodded slowly. That's a hell of a thing to learn over breakfast. Yes, Carl agreed. A hell of a thing. Red spoke up from where he sat on a hay bale. You know what I learned in the last war, boys? I learned that the men who start wars never fight in them. It's always some poor son of a bitch like us who ends up in the mud fighting for reasons we don't fully understand. Kaiser's war, Hitler's war, don't matter, same story. Old men talk, young men die. He looked at Carl directly. That's the thing about freedom, son, real freedom. It ain't about what they tell you. It's about what you can see with your own eyes, what you can think for yourself. Americans believe a man should be free to make his own choices, even if those choices are wrong, especially if they're wrong, because that's how you learn. Carl understood maybe half the words, but he understood all of the meaning. Freedom was not following orders. Freedom was questioning them. The conversation drifted after that to easier topics. How to fix a fence post. The best way to break a stubborn horse. Whether it would rain before Christmas. Small talk between working men who had found common ground in the universal language of labor and lunch. But the moment had planted something. A seed of understanding. These Americans were not monsters. They were just men. Men who worked hard and ate well and believed in things like fairness and second chances. If the Americans were not monsters, then who were? That question would be answered 3 weeks later when the mail arrived at Camp Swift, January 15, 1945. The Red Cross truck pulled into camp carrying the first batch of letters from home. Months of delay, months of military censorship and international routing, but finally the connection to Germany that every prisoner had been waiting for. Sergeant Riley stood in the assembly hall with a canvas bag containing 67 letters. 156 prisoners sat waiting. That meant 89 men would get nothing. 89 men whose families were dead or missing or unable to write. The names were called alphabetically. Carl sat frozen as Riley worked through the list. When his name finally came, the relief was physical. Someone in Germany still lived. Someone still remembered him. The letter was thin, a single page. His mother's handwriting cramped and shaky. It had been written in December 6 weeks ago. Carl's hands trembled as he unfolded it. The words hit him like shrapnel. His father was dead, killed in an air raid on Berlin in November. The same month Carl had been eating bacon at Camp Swift. While Carl had been learning to ride horses and laugh with cowboys, his father had been crushed under rubble. His mother was staying with neighbors in a cellar. The bread ration had been cut to 150 grams per day, less than a slice. They were burning furniture for heat because there was no coal. The building next door had been destroyed. She did not know if she would survive the winter, but she was proud of him. Proud that he was alive. Proud that he was safe even as a prisoner. "Stay safe, my son," she had written at the end. "Stay alive. That is all that matters now." Carl folded the letter carefully. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely control them. Around him, other men were reading their own letters. Some were crying, some sat stone-faced. Franz Muller had gone completely white, the letter falling from his nerveless fingers. That night in the barracks, the mood was darker than it had been since they arrived. Franz's letter had told him that his mother and two sisters were dead, killed in the Dresden firebombing on February 13th. The letter had been written before the bombing by his mother. It had crossed in the mail with news of her own death. Hans had received nothing. His family was in the Soviet zone. No mail was getting through. He did not know if they were alive or dead or displaced. The not knowing was worse than knowing. Otto's wife was alive, but barely. The children had been evacuated to the countryside. She did not know where. The authorities would not tell her. She wrote that she prayed for him every night, but her prayers felt empty. In the corner of the barracks, men gathered to talk in low voices. Carl sat on his bunk staring at his mother's letter, trying to reconcile two impossible truths. His family was starving, dying, living in hell, and he was warm, fed, learning to ride horses. Franz spoke first, his voice bitter and raw. "We sit here fed and comfortable while our families die. How is this right? How is this justice?" Otto replied quietly, "Would you starving help them?" "No, but eating feels like betrayal." Carl looked up. "Americans did not kill my father. Allied bombs did. British bombs, maybe. American bombs. But not the Americans here, not Riley, not Red. They are feeding us. They are treating us like human beings. How do I reconcile this?" No one had an answer. The question hung in the air, unanswerable and heavy. Victor Hoffman, who had refused to work and had been confined to camp, spoke from his bunk. "You reconcile it by remembering that they are still the enemy, that this kindness is strategy, that we are Germans and we do not forget." "Forget what?" Carl asked, his voice rising. "Forget that our leaders lied to us. Forget that they sent us to die while they ate well. Forget that they told us Americans were monsters, when the truth is Americans treat us better than our own officers did." Victor stood. The tension in the room went electric. "Careful, Zimmerman. Those words sound like treason." "Treason against what?" Carl shot back. "Germany is defeated. The war is lost. Everyone knows it. What are we being loyal to a government that fed us sawdust bread and told us we were the master race? A Führer who is hiding in a bunker while Berlin burns." The room went completely silent. No one had said these things out loud before. They had all thought them, but speaking them was different. Speaking them made them real. Victor's face went red with rage, but before he could respond, the door opened. Sergeant Riley stood there, backlit by the outside lights. His face was serious. "Zimmerman," Riley said, "come with me." Carl's blood went cold. Someone had heard. Someone had reported him. This was it. This was where the kindness ended and the punishment began. He followed Riley across the dark compound in silence. They walked past the mess hall, past the administration building, all the way to the garage where Carl had been working on truck repairs earlier that week. Riley opened the door and gestured Carl inside. Then he closed it behind them and turned on a single work light. The shadows were long and strange. "I'm not here to punish you," Riley said quietly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. "I heard what you said about your father, about reconciling things. I wanted to show you something." He handed Carl the photograph. It showed a young man in an American uniform, handsome, smiling, maybe 21 years old. "This is my brother Tommy," Riley said. "He died June 8, 1944, Normandy, killed by a Panzer shell." Carl's throat closed. He could not breathe. "I am sorry," he managed. "Could have been your tank," Riley continued. His voice was steady but strained. "Could have been you who fired that shell. For 6 months after Tommy died, I hated every German I saw. I wanted you all to suffer. I wanted revenge." He paused, looking at the photograph in Carl's hands. "Then I watched you boys cry over bacon. And I realized something. Tommy wouldn't want me to hate. He wrote me letters from the front. He talked about how he hated bombing cities because he knew there were people down there. Regular people. Families. He said they were just people on the wrong side, but still just people." Riley took the photograph back and looked at it for a long moment. "Your mother's letter says your father died in an air raid. American bombs, probably. Maybe even a raid Tommy participated in before he died. So we're even, I guess. Both lost our fathers to this war." "No," Carl said quietly. "We are not even. We are both just victims of old men's wars." Riley looked up, surprise flickering across his face. Then slowly he extended his hand. Carl stared at it. This was the moment, the choice to remain enemies or to become something else. Something the propaganda on both sides said was impossible. He took Riley's hand. They shook, firm, equal. Two men who had lost too much choosing not to lose their humanity too. "Your father," Riley said after a moment. "What was he like?" Carl had to swallow twice before he could speak. "He was teacher, mathematics. He loved puzzles and chess. He never won the war. He say Hitler was madman. But what could he do? One man against a nation." "My father was a farmer," Riley replied. "Grew wheat in Oklahoma. Lost the farm in the Depression, but never lost his faith that things would get better. He died thinking Tommy died for something important. I hope he was right." They stood together in the dim garage, two enemies who had chosen to stop being enemies. Outside, the Texas wind blew cold across the empty land. Inside, something new was being born. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but the possibility of friendship, the seed of it. What neither man knew yet was that this conversation would matter. That in 4 months, when Germany surrendered and the prisoners faced repatriation, this moment would be the foundation of a choice that would shock Washington and change lives. But that was still ahead. For now, there was just this. Two men in a garage holding photographs of the dead, choosing to honor them by refusing to add more hatred to a world that had already seen too much. April 30th, 1945. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath Berlin. The news reached Camp Swift 3 days later, crackling through radio speakers across the compound. 156 German prisoners stood in formation, listening to the announcement in stunned silence. Their Führer, the man they had been taught to worship as a god, had taken his own life rather than face defeat. Carl felt nothing, no grief, no shock, just a hollow emptiness where belief used to be. The man who had promised them glory had given them only ashes. And now he was dead, and Germany was finished, and everything Carl had fought for turned out to be built on lies and corpses. May 7th brought the official surrender. Germany capitulated unconditionally to the Allies. The war in Europe was over. In the mess hall that evening, Captain Bradford made the announcement that every prisoner had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. "Gentlemen, the war has ended. Germany has surrendered. Beginning June 1st, you will be processed for repatriation. You will be returned to Germany." The expected response would have been cheers, relief, joy at going home. Instead, the hall filled with silence so thick you could choke on it. Return to what Carl thought. Return to Berlin in ruins. To a mother starving in a cellar. To a country divided between Soviet and American zones. To no job, no home, no future. To a place where being a returned POW meant suspicion and shame, where people would ask why you survived when so many others died. That night, Carl could not sleep. He lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of men breathing in the darkness. Some were crying quietly. Others lay awake like him, wrestling with impossible questions. Around midnight, Otto Schmidt sat up. His silhouette was visible in the moonlight through the window. "I do not want to go back," Otto said quietly in German. The words fell like stones into still water. Every man in the barracks heard them, but no one responded. To say such a thing out loud was to admit defeat, to accept that Germany was truly lost, to choose exile over homeland. Franz Muller's voice came from the darkness. "What are you saying?" "I am saying my wife wrote to me. She told me to stay if I can. Germany has nothing to offer us. No food, no work, no future. She said if I can stay here and send money that would help more than coming home to starve together." Karl sat up slowly. "We are prisoners of war. They cannot just let us stay." "Maybe," Otto replied. "Maybe not. But I have to ask, what is the worst they can say? No. Then we go back to Germany anyway. But if they say yes," the possibility hung in the air like smoke. To stay in America, to work, to send money home, to rebuild a life in a country that had treated them better in 6 months of captivity than Germany had treated them in 3 years of service. It was Franz who spoke next, and his words surprised everyone. "I have nothing to return to. My mother is dead. My sisters are dead. My city is rubble. If I go back to Dresden, what will I do? Live in ruins and eat from Allied charity? At least here I could work." "This is treason." Victor Hoffman's voice cut through the darkness. "You speak of abandoning the fatherland." "The fatherland abandoned us," Karl said quietly. "It sent us to die for lies. It starved our families while telling us we were superior. It destroyed itself with hate and arrogance. What loyalty do we owe to that?" Victor stood his shadow large and menacing. "You will regret these words, Zimmermann. All of you. Germany will rise again, and you will be remembered as cowards who chose comfort over duty." "I choose survival over suicide," Karl replied. "If that makes me a coward, then I am a coward. But I will be a living coward who can help my mother, not a dead hero buried in rubble." The argument could have escalated into violence. Instead, it simply ended with Victor storming out of the barracks, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. In the silence that followed, Otto spoke again. "Tomorrow I will ask Sergeant Riley if this is possible. Who wants to join me?" 30 hands went up in the darkness. The next morning, Karl, Otto, and Franz approached Riley during morning formation. The sergeant looked tired. The end of the war had brought more paperwork and bureaucracy, not less. He had been up late processing reports and requisitions. "Sergeant Riley," Karl began in careful English, "we have question, important question." Riley looked at the 3 Germans standing before him. He had worked with these men for 6 months, had watched them transform from broken prisoners into something else, something better than what they had been. "What is it, Zimmermann, is possible if we stay in America, work, send money to families in Germany?" Riley's expression went blank with shock. "You want to stay here?" Otto stepped forward. "We have nothing in Germany, Sergeant. Families starving, cities destroyed. Here we can work, earn money, send help. Is better for everyone." Franz added, "And we learned something here, that Americans are not monsters, that propaganda lies, that maybe there is a different way to live than what we were taught." Riley stared at them for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away without a word. Yeah. The 3 Germans looked at each other, uncertain whether they had just made a terrible mistake. An hour later, Riley knocked on Captain Bradford's office door. She looked up from her paperwork, saw his face, and knew something significant had happened. "Ma'am, we have a situation. 31 of the German prisoners want to apply for displaced person status. They want to stay in America, work, send money back to their families." Bradford set down her pen slowly. "That's unprecedented." "Yes, ma'am." "It could end both our careers." "Yes, ma'am." Bradford leaned back in her chair. Through her window, she could see the German prisoners working in the compound garden, planting vegetables for the summer harvest. 6 months ago, they had arrived broken and defeated. Now they were building something, growing something. "You know what Tommy died for, Jack?" she asked quietly. The question caught Riley off guard. "Ma'am, your brother, my husband, all of them. They died so people could be free. free to choose their own futures, free to make their own decisions. These men want a chance at that freedom. Seems pretty American to me. She picked up her phone. Get me the State Department. What happened next surprised everyone involved. Captain Bradford did not just file a request. She launched a campaign, letters to senators, calls to the Red Cross, formal petitions citing displaced persons, provisions, and humanitarian precedents. She argued that German prisoners fleeing the Soviet zone had legitimate refugee claims, that helping them was both morally right and politically advantageous in the growing Cold War. And she was not the only one fighting. Red Henderson sat at his kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in May, writing a letter to his senator. His wife stood behind him, reading over his shoulder. "You sure about this, Red?" she asked. "Folks might not understand." "Don't care what folks understand," Red replied. "I understand. These boys worked my ranch for 6 months. Hardest workers I ever seen. Honest, respectful, want to make something of themselves. If America stands for anything, it stands for giving people a second chance." He finished the letter and read it aloud. "Dear Senator Johnson, I am a rancher in Texas. I fought Kaiser Germany in 1918. I lost my boy at Guadalcanal in 1943. I got every reason in the world to hate the Germans. But I got 31 German prisoners working my ranch right now, and I am writing to tell you they are good men, not Nazis, just men who got caught up in something bigger than themselves and came out the other side wanting to be better. They want to stay in America, work honest jobs, send money to their starving families. I am offering employment to all 31 at fair wages. If America cannot give these men a second chance, then what the hell did my boy die for? Respectfully, William Henderson." The letter made its way to the Dallas Morning News, then to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, then to papers across Texas. The headline read, "Texas Rancher Offers Jobs to Former Nazi Prisoners." The reaction was immediate and divided. Veterans groups protested. How dare America reward enemy soldiers while American boys were still dying in the Pacific churches, supported the move, citing biblical principles of forgiveness and redemption. Politicians split along party lines. Some saw it as dangerous sympathy for the enemy. Others saw it as a demonstration of American values. Captain Bradford received orders from Washington. Stop the program. Cease all advocacy. Prepare the prisoners for immediate repatriation. She read the orders twice. Then she picked up her phone and called the general who had sent them. "Sir, I am formally requesting permission to appeal this decision." "Eleanor, this comes from the top. The answer is no." "Then I will resign my commission and continue advocating as a civilian." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You would throw away your career for 31 German prisoners." "I would throw away my career for the principle that America keeps its promises. We promise these men fair treatment under Geneva Convention. We promise them dignity. Now we are going to send them back to Soviet-occupied zones where they will be arrested as collaborators. That is not the America my husband died for." Another long pause. Then the general sighed. "File your appeal. I will see what I can do. But no promises, Eleanor. No promises." While the bureaucratic battle raged in Washington, life at Camp Swift continued. The prisoners worked. They learned English. They wrote letters home. And they waited. Victor Hoffman refused to participate in any of it. He spent his days in the barracks reading and rereading old German newspapers from before the war, clinging to a version of Germany that no longer existed. On June 15th, Victor and his 12 loyalists were processed for repatriation. They would board a ship to Bremen, then travel to Berlin. Soviet zone. Carl stood in the compound watching as Victor prepared to leave. "This is your last chance, Zimmerman," Victor said. "Come with us. Return to the fatherland with honor." Carl shook his head. "The fatherland betrayed us, Victor. It sent us to die for lies, starved our families while promising glory. I choose truth over propaganda. I choose life over ideology." Victor's face twisted with contempt. "You choose comfort. You choose to be a pet for your captors." "No," Carl replied quietly. "I choose to survive, to help my mother survive. That is not betrayal. That is duty, the real duty. Not to a government or a flag, but to the people we love." Victor spat on the ground between them. Then he turned and walked through the gate, his 12 followers trailing behind. Carl watched him go and felt nothing but pity. Victor was returning to a Germany that no longer existed, carrying beliefs that had been proven false. He would spend the rest of his life bitter and broken, unable to accept that he had been wrong. That same week, a telegram arrived at Camp Swift. Captain Bradford opened it with shaking hands. Riley stood in her office watching her face as she read. "Well," he asked when she finished. Bradford looked up and Riley saw tears in her eyes. "Approved. 28 of 31 applicants granted displaced person status. Temporary work permits, pathway to citizenship in 5 years. 3 had been denied, former SS members whose records showed direct participation in war crimes. But 28 had been approved. 28 men would get their second chance." Riley delivered the news to the barracks that evening. Carl sat on his bunk as the sergeant read the names. Zimmerman Carl, Schmidt Otto, Mueller Franz. Approved. 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 Carl put his face in his hands and wept. Not from sadness, not from relief, from hope. Pure, overwhelming hope for the first time since the war began. The years that followed proved that hope was justified. Carl worked Red Henderson's ranch from 1946 to 1949. He learned English fluently, practicing every night by reading American newspapers and listening to radio programs. Every month he sent $50 to his mother in Berlin. $50 went further and destroyed Germany than most people realized. It was enough to buy food on the black market, enough to bribe officials for better housing, enough to keep his mother alive. In 1950, Carl married an American woman named Sarah Miller. She was a teacher in the local school, patient and kind, who saw past his accent and his history to the man he was trying to become. They had a son in 1953. Carl named him Thomas Jackson Zimmerman. Thomas for Riley's dead brother, Jackson for Riley himself, the man who had chosen compassion over hate. Otto Schmidt moved to Houston and worked as a mechanic. His wife joined him in 1947, thin and exhausted from 2 years of surviving in Soviet-occupied Berlin, but alive. They opened their own garage in 1951. By 1955, they employed 15 Americans and had become respected members of the community. Their garage specialized in German cars, and Otto's reputation for honest work spread across the city. Franz Muller went to the University of Texas on a special displaced persons scholarship. He studied engineering with a focus on rocketry. By 1960, he was working for NASA in Huntsville, Alabama. When America put men on the moon in 1969, Franz was part of the team that made it happen. A former German soldier helping America win the space race against the Soviets. The irony was not lost on him, and Jack Riley became their friend. Not just an acquaintance, a real friend. The kind who came to weddings and birthday parties, who helped Carl move into his first house, who taught young Thomas how to fish. The kind of friendship that proved enemies could become brothers if they chose to. 30 years passed, July 4th, 1975. The sky over Red Henderson's ranch was the kind of blue that only existed in Texas. Carl Zimmerman stood by the barbecue grill, turning steaks and watching smoke rise into the endless sky. He was 58 years old now. Gray hair, weathered hands, an American citizen for 23 years. Around him, 3 generations gathered. His son Thomas, 22 years old, home from college. Otto's grandchildren running through the grass. Franz and his wife visiting from Alabama. And Jack Riley, 64 now, and retired, sitting in a lawn chair with a beer in his hand and a smile on his weathered face. Red Henderson had died 5 years earlier, but his son Bill ran the ranch now, and the tradition continued. Every 4th of July they gathered here. The men who had chosen second chances, the families they had built, the America they had helped create. On the grill, bacon sizzled alongside the steaks. The smell carried across the yard, and Carl paused, breathing it in. 31 years ago, the smell of bacon had changed his life, had shown him that everything he believed was a lie, had started him on a path from enemy to citizen, from prisoner to free man. His son Thomas walked over carrying 2 beers. He handed one to his father. "Dad, I have been meaning to ask you something. How did you end up in Texas?" Carl looked at Jack Riley across the yard. Riley raised his beer in a silent salute. Carl returned it, then turned to his son. "Your namesake saved my life," Carl said. "Not by forgiving me, by feeding me." Thomas looked confused. "I thought Grandpa Jack just worked at the POW camp." "He did more than work there. He showed me what America really means. Not propaganda, not politics, just breakfast, just kindness when cruelty would have been easier. He gestured to the bacon on the grill. Every time I smell bacon, I remember the day I learned the truth. That freedom is not about being better than others. It is about giving others the chance to be better. Your grandfather understood that. So did Red. So did Captain Bradford. They gave me a second chance when they had every reason not to. Thomas was quiet for a moment processing this. What happened to the guys who went back to Germany? Karl's face darkened. Victor Hoffman returned to Berlin in 1945. Soviet zone. He was arrested as an American sympathizer because he had been a POW. They sent him to a labor camp in Siberia. He died there in 1952, still believing he had been right and the world had been wrong. He paused, looking at his son. Two men, same prison camp, different choices. Victor chose ideology over reality. I chose bacon over belief. He died bitter and broken. I lived to see my son graduate college and my grandchildren born. I lived to become American. Riley walked over to join them, moving slow on knees worn out by age and hard work. He put his hand on Karl's shoulder. You know what I learned from all this, Riley said. America did not win the war just by beating Germany on the battlefield. We won by showing that the American way, freedom and dignity, and second chances is stronger than any ideology. Those 28 men we helped, they went back to visit Germany during the Cold War. They told everyone Americans are not monsters. They are just people who believe everyone deserves a chance. He squeezed Karl's shoulder. That message did more to fight communism than any bomb we could have dropped. The afternoon wore on. They ate steaks and bacon and corn on the cob. The children played. The adults talked about everything and nothing, politics and weather and the price of cattle. The comfortable conversation of friends who had known each other long enough that silence was okay too. As the sun set, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and red, Karl stood alone for a moment, watching his family. His son, his grandchildren, his friends. All of it built on a choice made 31 years ago over a plate of bacon and eggs. Captain Eleanor Bradford had been right. America's strength came not from its weapons, but from its values. From the belief that people could change, that enemies could become friends, that second chances mattered. Karl thought about his father, dead in Berlin 31 years ago. Thought about Tommy Riley killed at Normandy. Thought about all the men on both sides who died in that war. They had not died for territory or ideology. They had died so that one day a German prisoner and an American sergeant could stand side by side at a barbecue, watching their children play together in peace. That was worth something. That meant their deaths had not been completely meaningless. As darkness fell, Karl lit the sparklers for the grandchildren. They ran through the yard, waving trails of light, laughing innocent of the history that had brought their families together. They did not know about the war, about the bacon, about the choice between going home to ruins or staying to build something new. Maybe someday Karl would tell them, but not tonight. Tonight was for celebration, for remembering not the darkness, but the light that came after, for honoring the men like Riley and Red and Bradford who had chosen kindness when hate would have been easier. The sparklers burned out. The children were gathered up and put to bed. The adults sat around the dying fire talking quietly, their voices carrying across the empty land. Karl looked up at the stars, the same stars that shone over Germany, over Normandy, over all the places where men had fought and died. But here under this Texas sky, those stars meant something different. They meant freedom. They meant second chances. They meant home. Jack Riley raised his beer one final time. To Tom, he said quietly, and to all the boys who did not make it home, may we live lives worthy of their sacrifice. To Tommy, Karl echoed, and to my father, and to everyone who died so we could be here tonight, choosing peace over hate. They drank in silence, honoring the dead by living well. And in that moment, under the stars of a Texas night, with the smell of barbecue smoke still in the air and the sound of children sleeping nearby, Karl understood the final truth. The war had not ended with Germany's surrender. It had ended here, with bacon and friendship and the choice to build instead of destroy. That was the real victory, not on battlefields, but in hearts, not through violence, but through the simple revolutionary act of treating your enemy like a human being, and it had all started with breakfast.